There are all these systems in our lives that underpin our health, our prosperity, our security. We don't think much about them and often can't see what's going on with them. Today on the podcast, we're going to talk about visibility. What if you could create a digital immune system, watching every piece of data flowing through these digital networks?
You had cybersecurity being talked about that it was going to quickly surpass the illicit drug trade in terms of economic wealth transfer from good people to bad actors.
We have this edge because we can process ridiculous amounts of data that we can actually predict where the bad stuff is going.
What if you could see everything flowing through the supply chain network?
20% of every single dollar that is spent in manufacturing goes to waste. What if every single physical asset had a voice? It will fundamentally change how we behave and how we interact with physical assets and things that we use on a daily basis.
We're going to talk to the Chorus and Chronicle teams about if you could see that kind of data, what kinds of bad things could you get ahead of and prevent? I'm Astro, your host and captain of Moonshots, and this is the Moonshot Podcast. We're going to have a conversation today about a digital immune system, cybersecurity, and what we can do about it. Mike, Steven, Shapor, let's start with Mike. Tell us, what was the original what if for Chronicle? That sort of like crazy idea and maybe the aha that happened that made it feel like it wasn't completely crazy.
In 2015, I was running Google, the threat analysis group. Shapor worked with me, sat next to me on that team. And I went to a meeting for Google with the FBI out in DC, and they wanted to share with us some cutting edge cyber intelligence about nation state attacks. And I go into this room and they give us a piece of paper. And it had 20 domain names, A.com, B.com, and they're like, these are bad. If you have any traffic from your enterprises to these networks, you need to go get help. Go call up Mandiant or someone. And I'm looking at it, and I said, these are all old. This is what these people were using 6 months ago. That's not new. Pull my laptop out, connect to one of the systems Shapor and I helped build, and I'm like, I write down about a dozen more, and I'm like, this is what they're using this morning. And I slide this paper back over to the FBI. And they asked, how did you do that? And then I said, I can't tell you, it's classified. And
that's awesome.
And so I'm looking around the room, and all the other companies that were there, the representatives are staring at this paper, and they're like, I don't know what to do with this. And so then I remember coming back, and I was talking with Shapor, and I was like, we have this edge because we can process at Google ridiculous amounts of data that we can actually predict where the bad stuff is going. When the opportunity came up to talking with Sergey one day, he said, why don't you do that as a moonshot? Like, if it's useful for other people to be able to get this visibility and store data, why don't you turn that into a thing?
So if that was the opportunity, how did that what if turn into a kind of mission?
It started as the idea, what if we could take some of the security-specific log processing techniques and systems that we had built at Google over the previous 5-6 years and turn it into a service? Like, instead of just putting records in a data lake and calling it done, like, what if we could actually build something that could synthesize insights and knowledge and correlate at scale, not over the last 72 hours or last 90 days, but over years. It gives an asymmetric advantage to a defender when they've only ever had an asymmetric disadvantage.
So, Steven, tell a little bit how you collided in those really early days with this team that wasn't even called Chronicle yet.
Yeah, it wasn't. And it was before it was called Chronicle, it was called Lantern. There was a code name. So we used that term interchangeably in the early years. So while they were at Google proper, I was at Google Ventures as an operating executive. And when Alphabet took shape that year, there was kind of a quiet call that went out to say, hey, if you're entrepreneurial and you have a big idea about what could potentially be a sister company to Google, Google X is the place to be. And so I came over to Google X. I met with you, and then you connected Mike and I, and later Shapor. We met in the cafe. I think Sergey was with us or the first couple sessions, and we just started brainstorming to do something awesome, and let's use Google X to launch it.
Shapor, tell us a little bit about a digital immune system. In the early days of what was eventually called Lantern, way before it was Chronicle, we weren't just talking about doing a better antivirus piece of software. The aspiration was much bigger, much more kind of robust and resilient. What did that mean in the early days?
I think a big part of that came from thinking about security at Google and doing security a kind of a bit of a different way that was based off of all of the data that we had about what was happening in our system. So we really started thinking about, what would it look like to do that? We were kind of layering on top of a lot of things that Google had built around analytics and web search. But, kind of selfishly and looking back to my role before, I wanted better tools for doing that, right? I wanted to be able to, very quickly determine what was happening on a part of the network or on some host somewhere.
I'm not a security person, so tell me if this isn't fair, but my kind of early understanding was that the way cybersecurity was working at the time was mostly getting a fingerprint of the bad guy. So we were kind of like, everyone was sort of sniffing for a fingerprint for the bad guy on their network. And what you were talking about in the early days of Lantern was looking at everything flowing through the network and doing the detective work necessary to say, that looks a little odd. There's probably something not right going on here, which is very different than looking for a fingerprint of a known bad guy.
So
is that fair or not fair?
Yeah, that's very fair. I at the time, and I still use this one analogy, there's a picture that you can find online of like the FBI fingerprint database from like 1940. And if, I'm going to get the year wrong, but it's like 1940 approximate. And it looks like an aircraft hangar that you can store multiple 747s in. It's gigantic. And inside of it is just rows of, I want to date myself here, of library card catalog style drawers. Your Dewey Decimal System little cards, right? Like half the people listening probably are not going to know what I'm talking about.
Google it.
But yeah, you should Google it. But you pull out the drawer and there was just cards, the fingerprints from what they've collected. Now think about it like this. If you go out and someone robbed a bank and they got away, but they got the fingerprint, they're not going to get caught because you can't search, 100 million cards by hand, physically picking up each one. So you might have the data, but you lack the ability to identify the bad thing with what you have. If you don't have the data at all, it doesn't matter, right? But if you have the data, but you lack an ability to search it, well, then fundamentally, you might as well not have the data. And so when I think we were thinking about what would become Chronicle, it's not just collecting the data, but it's making it searchable. Shapor and I remember early days, we would go visit other companies and we would sit in their security operations centers called a SOC, and we would just shoulder surf. We'd watch them and see how did they work, what tools did they use. And I remember asking, at one company, it was in Southern California, I remember asking them, do you know what people went to ESPN.com yesterday? And they said, oh, yeah, we can tell you that data. And I said, how many? And the person types a query into their log system and hits a button, and 17 minutes later, they had 912. I remember in a debrief session, Shapor and I spoke with him, and we were like, so you can't do it. He goes, no, I did it. No, you can't do it. Because if I were to give you a list of 1,000 bad things, well, if each one takes 17 minutes, you don't have enough time in the day before you effectively have to start over. And so that's where you start thinking about, this is the fingerprint database of the FBI. You have to go over and not only have it, but you have to search it really fast.
So there was the fingerprint number one, Then there's being able to search the fingerprints, number 2. That's what you're describing. But at least my memory was that if Bob normally logs in from San Francisco, and all of a sudden now Bob apparently is logging in from Kazakhstan, that doesn't by itself prove something bad happened, but all things being equal, that tends to be a weak but meaningful signal that something odd is going on. Am I remembering correctly that that was an important part of Chronicle too?
Start with Bob logging into his email from Kazakhstan. Maybe Bob's on vacation. I hear Kazakhstan's lovely.
Yeah.
Bob logs into his email from Kazakhstan, but 3 minutes prior, he swiped his door badge to access an elevator here in Mountain View, California.
Those things taken together.
Together, that's a really worrisome problem.
Back then, 8-10 years ago, that was, as I recall, was the year of what they called the mega breach, where the first breaches in society were 10, 15, 20 million identities compromised by some retail breach or something. Now it's in the hundreds of millions and billions. But if you go back and do a forensic review of some of what they called the mega breaches at the time, the big retailers, the big automotive companies, you found that in their data, what they would consider low quality log data or alert data, the systems, even of the time, were saying, hey, there's a problem here. But the problem is the 2 or 3 alerts are stuck in 2 or 3 million, okay, everything's okay. And asking a human being to go into that and be alerted, or to know that there may be 2 alerts saying, hey, there's a problem, you can't physically do that as a human. So the systems like Chronicle and Backstory ultimately would be able to detect that and surface it to the human in order for them to act.
Stephen, give us a sense of how big, how bad was this problem in 2015?
You had really active attacks coming from bad actors in the world, targeting every individual, every institution, every branch of the federal and state governments. Ransomware attacks where they take the data of a regional hospital and they encrypt it, and you can't get access to the data. That was happening even then. So you had every part of society and every individual in society at risk. You had cybersecurity being talked about that it was going to quickly surpass the illicit drug trade in terms of economic wealth transfer from good people to bad actors because of ransomware, because of payouts, because of damages done to reputation. It passed all of the illicit drug trade internationally combined.
Was it worldwide more than $1 trillion a year? Or give us an order of magnitude.
Yes, within those years, it was probably multiple trillions of dollars.
We talk about, these large breaches happening, but also the attackers, are always evolving, and the kind of threats that we saw working, at Google for many years, a lot of the kind of nation state sponsored top level attackers, that all started trickling down into things like ransomware, into, different groups that are kind of learning that tradecraft from the more sophisticated attackers.
You have to think like a bad guy. All 3 of you have to, in order to create tools that prevent the bad guys. Can you help us understand who are we defending against? How do they think?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because, I think a lot of folks have in their mind, a high school kid with a black hoodie on, at 2 a.m. trying to break into a system. And what it really looks like in the real world on the other side is someone working a job, a 9-to-5 job that their goal is to, have some outcome, compromise some organization.
But it's a bad actor job. You're not saying that they're like...
Yeah, and think of it, the way I've explained it to non-security people is think of it as like 3 tiers of bad people. The first tier is the young person that wants to deface their, alumni school website and take a screenshot of it and post it on TikTok and say, look what I did. And their motivation is primarily notoriety and some street cred and some online credit. The second tier, which is the digital arms or the organizational arms of these traditional organized crime units. And like Shapor said, they have org charts, they have bonuses, they have title promotion, and their motivation is mostly monetary and to be hired by others to create badness. And that's the ones we deal with a lot. And then the third tier, that's the nation state, the third tier. The nation state is not motivated by notoriety. They're not even motivated by monetary. They're in it for geopolitical, state secrets, intellectual property, regional destabilization. They're very patient and they're playing the long game, and it's ultimately the most dangerous of the three.
And they're very good at what they do. I mean, they do this day in, day out, every day. So as a defender, if you're sitting there thinking like, I've got this one port open on my firewall. There's this very small gap in my security, but I need that for some business reason. Like, they know that hole is there because every other organization that looks kind of like yours has that exact same hole. So I think from a defender side, that's the hardest thing to realize that like, hey, no, this is like someone's full-time job that they're really good at. They know where all the gaps are.
And the other dynamic that was changing in the last decade was it used to be before the teens, companies thought of security as a perimeter. You build a strong enough perimeter, and the goal is to keep the bad guys out and to keep the good things in. And that there's no more perimeter. They're already in, right? The hackers aren't hacking in, they're logging in because they have exploited credentials of your employees.
We've come at this issue of cybersecurity kind of circa 2015 in a number of different ways, but pop up to the 30,000, 50,000 foot level. Why was Chronicle different? Like, what most fundamentally was different about Chronicle than everything else that was being offered, and why do you think it hadn't been offered before?
I'm going to take a meta response to that one, right? And it's like, in security and most things, right? It's like, it's really hard to see over the horizon. In security, people often, they take the limitations of their tools as universal constants, the speed of light. Like, oh, I can't search for how many people went to ESPN.com yesterday faster than 17 minutes. So people grow to tolerate that and not challenge it. Because you're in an operations role. Your job is not to invent the future. Your job is to survive the day. I think one of the things that Shapor and I got from being at Google for so long is the culture challenges you to think big, think at an epic scale. It's like, I'm not even going to bother looking over the horizon. I'm going to go put a space telescope in Earth and in orbit and look down at the Earth. I'm going to see everything all at once and now question, what is the limitations of my view? And so we got this, for over a decade, right? Like over a decade had this indoctrination at Google in terms of how do I view the world the way Google would view the world?
We named the company Chronicle because we were trying to tell stories with the data that was otherwise considered low value and too expensive to maintain. If you wanted to watch these guys really get upset, they'd talk to a company and they would say it's too expensive to store the data, so we throw it away after 90 days. And they would just, steam would come out of their ear because they knew the value of the data over time. So part of the core value proposition of Chronicle was we had to be able to enable these companies to store it in ways that were economical and cost effective so they can keep it for years, not just weeks or months.
Obviously, the reason they were throwing it away is because there was a lot of
thought it was
and
low
expensive.
Value, and it was expensive, yeah.
But unpack for us a little bit, what do you mean by a lot of data?
I did the math on this one because I've always been trying to come up with a visualization to quantify log storage data, right? And I think even when I left Chronicle, it was probably over an exabyte of data in its systems. It's hard to fathom. If we were to take a SATA hard drive, the little metal thing, 0.8 of an inch thick, and we said we took a 4 terabyte SATA hard drive, and we just stack them one on top of each other like you were building just one tower of Jenga. The tower is exactly 3.1 miles tall or 5 kilometers. And when you think about that, one, that's a really tall tower, but think about it like this. Those hard drives just can't exist in some metaphorical tower leaning out in the desert. They have to go in computers. And so how many of those drives can you put in one computer? I don't know, say you can fit 8 in a computer. Okay, so now we have 125,000 servers. How much square footage, how much power, you can see how this problem just gets incredibly expensive. Even at Google scale, it becomes a really expensive value prop. But that's the data you need to do security.
Let's move forward a little bit. Backstory has now been built. And you have your coming out party for Chronicle at the big conference, RSA. What happened? How did that go?
We ended up launching at RSA. And I think, in retrospect, for the size of what we were doing and for the relative newness of it, I would say we won the show. We got a lot of attention, and hundreds, if not thousands, of leads started to come into the company through our CRM system.
I remember it was like 6,000 at one point.
Yeah, we had a bunch. We had a CRM system, and people would go to the website and they would register, and that started filling up. And we had like 5 salespeople looking at that, saying, "How am I their own data problem? How am I going to get through all these alerts?" Right?
I have too much opportunity.
Yeah.
I remember when we launched, Google had this event space a few blocks from the Moscone Center in San Francisco where we did our keynote. And I think within like an hour, every single available salesperson for a meeting was booked out. And the names were, it was like the big company names that you would see on the Fortune 500. And they were like pounding down the door and fighting with each other to get one of the initial meetings.
Yeah, and I think a big part of the reason why that worked is that it was a real problem that people were very acutely facing, especially at this time where, everyone's data volumes were coming up to Google scale, right? If you think about it, cloud was just getting adopted very heavily. These systems that folks had for many years that were just, now trying to scale up by 10 or 100x, and it just wasn't working.
So the next part of the story is Google ended up acquiring Chronicle. Can you sort of explain how that went down?
Early on in Lantern Chronicle, one of the senior Google executives pulled me aside and he said, we're very interested in what you're working on over there. So we had this momentum. We had the Chronicle and the Backstory product, which was launching. And so we had this crossroads. So the next chapter of our story is, do we take outside investor money? Do we stay profitable and don't grow as fast? Or is there something with Google because they're increasingly watching what we're doing and interestingly talking to Google Cloud customers who want better security solutions? And because we were already built on the Google systems, that was kind of door number 3.
We'll get back to it, but Mike, you fairly soon afterwards went out to do your own thing. You, as you were just describing, Stephen, went on to become the CEO of Verily. Shapor, you actually stayed with Chronicle, and Chronicle is now, many years later, a really important, vibrant part of cloud. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened after Chronicle joined cloud?
Yeah, it was, definitely a very challenging time. We had to basically pivot back from essentially being a startup to being a startup within a big company.
So after it went through this washing machine, do people use Backstory and Chronicle? Does it matter to cloud?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, that when the real validation came when Google continued to invest in the space and build Chronicle from, being more or less a standalone product to being a core piece of what's now called the security operations platform. And it, is composed of a bunch of other, bets that Google has made in the space, bringing, at the time, which was the largest, acquisition that Google had ever done, Mandiant into the fold. And now you see that continued investment with Wiz as well, that this is an area that's super important to Google and that Google's continuing to invest in, and it's all built on that core of Chronicle.
I have to now end on a sort of fond memory of your time at X.
If you want to get really good and you want to move the needle in this stuff, you have to go super broad. And that was one of the things I loved being about X. Right? I love sitting down next to people who are talking about using molten salt to store energy or self-driving cars or, any one of these crazy projects because it bred so much out of the box thinking.
Rarely do you get an opportunity in your career to work with such a diverse range of expertise. Nuclear physicist, and you're dealing with Gecko, remember the internal group of mechanical engineers and seamstresses doing stitching on your balloons. And you just kind of, and I still talk about that today at Verily when I talk about our origin in Google X. That was a gift. That was a gift as valuable as capital, as valuable as an office space, as valuable as introductions to customers. The mixing of the different projects, programs, and kind of entrepreneurial spirit is what I'm always fond of.
Mike, Stephen, Shapor, that's been amazing. Thank you so much for your time. Congratulations for what you built for the world. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
We just heard from the Chronicle team about how they've built the ability to watch every piece of data as it flows through the digital systems and then use that to get ahead of problems. Now we're going to talk to the Chorus Moonshot and how they can do the exact same thing in the supply chains of the world, giving a voice to everything that's been manufactured. Welcome, Stephen. Welcome, Suresh. Really grateful to have you guys here. We're talking about what it would look like to index the physical world. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Nice to be back here at X and talking about Chorus.
You know, in the early days, we were talking about what would it mean if every physical asset in the world could have a voice, if there could be visibility around that. How did you get from that to Chorus as the name of the moonshot?
That was the original provocation, is what if, every single physical asset had a voice? And we thought of that as like a musician playing music. So if you're a musician and you're, playing whatever, a violin, great, it's nice music. But what if we can get a whole bunch of musicians playing different instruments all together, performing as like a symphony orchestra? And that's where the name Chorus came from, because if we can get all of the physical assets to be chirping that way, can we orchestrate that to be a higher level experience? I've lived the problems that we're trying to solve with Chorus pretty much my entire career in every single company. And never had.
And what's that problem? Like, tell us what that problem is.
Managing your physical assets or goods, whether it's your inventories or timely deliveries or sending things, critical things to your customers and not knowing if it's actually going to reach them on time, and they don't know if they're going to receive it on time or not. So all of those problems, and when I first came here and was working or looking at different things, there were pieces of technology that were fascinating that I thought if we can put this together into meaningful services that can basically transform the way we make, move, and manage the world's goods, it would be very impactful. And that's sort of how Stephen, myself, and few of us in the early days of Chorus started putting this together.
As you were just suggesting, in some of your previous companies, you were responsible for moving an incredible amount of stuff around the planet. So you know this problem, but most of the listeners probably don't realize the kind or level of like waste, inefficiency, theft. Can you just give us a few examples?
Yeah, I'll give you a few statistics. 20% of every single dollar that is spent in manufacturing goes to waste. Okay, 40+% of the food we harvest and prepare is thrown away, and almost 1 billion people go hungry. In the United States, 69% of the time, healthcare is delayed because you're looking around for whatever is needed to care for that particular patient. And the most important caregivers or frontline caregivers like nurses spend a couple of hours every shift looking for whatever they need, whether it's medications, equipment, supplies, to be able to care for the patient.
Let's drill in for just a second. I'm imagining a nurse. Like, it can't be that she's like, I don't know where the x-ray machine is. Like, that just doesn't seem possible. Like, can you give us a specific or two?
There are so many pieces that are inside, in this case, the hospital. It's not the big equipment. Like, you're right. Oh, where's my MRI machine? Well, the MRI machine is actually in a room and installed, so it's not moving. But the things that move is where you have issue. A classic, or the simplest example that I can think of is like an infusion pump for IV supplies. So that requires a pump where you plug it in, and that's how the infused medication is going into the patient. Those pumps need to be cleaned, they need to be recalibrated, they need to be certified. So they're constantly going into different places. So if you have a patient that needs an IV and you don't have a pump, you are going to stand there and go, where's my infusion pump? So what do? Sometimes, a lot of times, nurses will keep them in like the ceiling tiles because nobody else can take it. And when they need to care for a patient, they can immediately take it. Their intentions are pure. They want to make sure that the patient is getting the care. So that's why this happens all the time, and patients move, right? So you have somebody who's in the emergency room or in the ICU, then you move them to a ward. All the stuff along with them has moved. Is anybody making sure that they actually go back to where they started? No.
So whether it's watching an infusion pump move around or bumpers head to like a automotive plant to be built into a car, ultimately it's about the data. But clearly you would have to have it's like you need hardware first in order to have some data to say something interesting about. Maybe Stephen, can you tell us anything about how in the early days of Chorus, where you have this chicken and egg, like how did you get started?
Our initial hypothesis was we actually do need a sensor that you can attach to every single thing that you want to track. And at the time, the technology wasn't quite there yet. So our thinking was there's still a lot to learn while we evolve the technology. So we started with some of these larger devices, like this is the original Scout One. It's about the size of a cell phone. You can almost call it like a traditional GPS tracker. You put it on a pallet, it sends a signal every few seconds to tell you its location. This is not something you're going to put on every infusion pump or every catheter, but it was a way for us to start learning about data and what data is interesting and what are the blind spots that we're going after. And that's kind of where Chorus has always been. Like, don't wait. Just start working with customers immediately, understanding, and allow that to guide your learning over the years.
So let's say somehow we're going to have to get back to the sensors and how the network works. But let's say for a moment, you can just see where every physical thing in the world is and how it's moving around. What are some of the things you could do with this data?
I'll be the first person to say that whatever applications that we have imagined till now and we have produced and our clients are benefiting from, we're probably scratching the surface. There is going to be an entire set of applications that we haven't even conceptualized yet because the data sets that we're creating are so unique that we have never seen that before. So as you unpack that data, as you learn from that data and the insights that you get, there will be more and more applications. So to give you examples of what we currently do, we call it visibility as a service. Just knowing where everything is and something about it and when you're going to either receive it or it's going to show up somewhere is a service we offer. We also do pharma, cold chain, food-related things where...
What's cold chain?
Cold chain is temperature sensitive, where it has to be refrigerated or kept under temperature control. So most food and vaccines and medications require that temperature control. So you cannot exceed a certain temperature range because that makes the product not safe, either for consumption or for administration. So we provide a service where we're monitoring these things in real time, no matter where it is, whether it's moving or not moving, inside or outside. And if something bad is going to happen, we actually proactively alert so you can prevent it and do something. We also provide inventory management services where, without counting, we can automatically tell you how many you have, how many you're using, and how many more you need to replenish your stock. And that is typically done in a manual counting fashion, whereas with Chorus, you don't actually have to sit there and count every piece. So if you have 10 different pieces of equipment that is used in a certain ward of a hospital, whether it's the cardiac ward or the neurology ward or whichever one, there are different products that different manufacturers provide. And a lot of them are really expensive, and you have to know how many you have.
These are disposables.
These are all things that you're like putting inside a patient to treat them or to cure a certain condition. So if you're going to do 10 surgeries a day of the same type, you need to have at least 10 of them available for you to care for those 10 patients. Well, do you know that there are 10 of them? The only way you know is by going and counting them, either at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day. And if you only have 2, you need to call the manufacturer and say, send me 8 more or 10 more so I have enough.
So someone's going into a closet and going 1, 2, like
Pretty
literally
much.
counting like the stints that would go into somebody?
Yeah, either they're counting it, sometimes sometimes daily, sometimes weekly. But that's what happens, not just in healthcare. That's the state of the art. ABCD counting and cycle counting, which are sort of the industry terms that are used in managing inventories, has been there for as long as I've been in my professional life.
You showed us a place that you started, but tell us what the sensor is and how the data actually flows through the system back to your system in the cloud where you can actually figure out all these services. How does that work?
So maybe what I'll do is I'll talk about one of the more recent sensors. So this is what we call the Seeker. So this is a printable sensor. So it looks like a business card or a label, but this is actually a sensor that's a little over a millimeter thick. So you can print it on an industrial printer. When you tear it off and you stick it on a box, it actually starts to chirp. It actually starts to say kind of, here I am on a regular basis. If you look underneath of it, you'll see a thin battery, you'll see a temperature sensor, and the key thing is you'll see a Bluetooth radio. You can almost think of this as like a printable AirTag. You print this, it starts talking over Bluetooth to nearby phones, to nearby laptops, to nearby Wi-Fi access points. And that's how we start to know exactly the location of all these individual boxes as they move through the supply chain.
So if you have this business card sized sticker that you're just going to start putting on things so that they start to have a voice in the physical world, as you just said, Stephen, it starts to chirp. Someone has to be listening for that chirping. What is listening to those chirps? And do you have to put physical assets in the world to listen to those chirps? Like, how does that work?
So this is what we call our infrastructure light strategy. So companies have invested a lot in Wi-Fi access points, laptops, handheld scanners. And as I mentioned before, what we need is a Bluetooth-enabled device that can connect to the internet. So we work with companies to get their permission to configure their access points and their handheld scanners and devices of that nature to listen to our sensors and send that data to us.
Way back at the beginning, we have definitely had moonshots here that wandered pretty hard on the vision. And I would say Chorus actually didn't wander on the vision at a very high level, kind of at the 100,000 foot view. Chorus was saying almost identically the same thing 5 years ago than what you just said in terms of what would be nice. But you didn't have the software, you didn't have the hardware. Tell us a little bit about all of the beginnings. Like, you're trying to design like a chip that goes into a sticker.
Our vision didn't wander that much. But what we've always said is we're going to learn what the customers want, what the business is going to look, and the technological development in parallel. And each of them is going to inform the other to accelerate it. And anytime we could take advantage of something that is out there that we could quickly use and use that as a surrogate, like if you take the sticker, we didn't have stickers at that time, but we said, well, as Stephen was pointing out, we're taking this device that's the size of a cell phone, and we said, we're just going to pretend that this is a sticker. But the data coming from it is going to be what comes from the sticker. Can we actually make sense out of this data and derive something useful out of it? So, and that's kind of like how we started, even when we put our first algorithms together. One more example, we thought that we don't need a battery. We thought we could just harvest energy.
In the sticker.
Sticker that we didn't have.
Right.
The sticker that we wanted to build.
Wait, so unpack that for a second. I remember this, but in the very early days, we didn't just think it was possible. We thought it was necessary that the sticker would ultimately not have a battery.
That's right.
Why and how was that? How could you do that?
Oh, this is actually a good story. We thought that for us, this to be simple, where we can just put it on everything, we can't have batteries. We need to be able to harvest energy and make this recharge itself.
Harvest energy from where?
From the surroundings.
From the radio frequencies that are kind of vibrating to the air?
We didn't know. We had a lot of different things. We thought radio frequency was one, light was another one, sound was another one. So we thought if we could harvest energy from any of these ambient sources and make that recharge the battery, or the battery that didn't exist.
The capacitor.
But give it energy so it can chirp. And we had a lot of R&D, which we still do, that we did around that tag. And it's really hard. Okay? And what it also does is that limits you just to the indoors. What happens when you move from this building and you go outside? That's been the limiting factor for a lot of the technology to be adapted for applications like this, is they get restricted by indoor versus outdoor. So we went out and we did a pretty large study on this thing. And what we found is the customers actually want a predictable signal, but what they did not want is they did not want to sit there and maintain it. They did not want to sit there and say, oh, the battery is running out, let me change the battery. So we said, well, what now we have to go invent is technology where it's a maintenance-free battery, so we can get a predictable signal out of the sticker. And that was probably one of the most important decisions that we made.
So you guys have said printable a bunch of times, but does that really matter?
Well, so if you think about the way a supply chain works and how you know that something is traveling with something else, there's a scanning process that often happens. And we started thinking about, how do you even eliminate that? And so for us, we started saying, what is on every shipment? What is on every product? It's a label. There's always a shipping label. There's always a product label. So if we can come up with a sensor that's actually something you could print as a label, then all the customer needs to do is take our template, swap it into their printer, and it just works.
X tends to lean in the following direction, and Chorus is a particularly nice example of this, is systems thinking. You mentioned, for example, indoor versus outdoor. But what else would a real solution, an end-to-end solution, have to transcend besides indoor versus outdoor? What other kinds of things in order for it to be really a holistic solution?
There's a couple of more things that we do, and we think that those are important. First is transcending location. The second is transcending modalities of transportation. So whether you're on an airplane or you're on a commercial carrier or you're on a courier who's bringing it to you, each one has their own unique way of tracking what they're shipping. None of them are tied together. So we can spend like the next 25 years trying to tie all of them together, or generate a data set, a unique data set that's sitting on top of it, which is what Chorus does. So we transcend modalities of transportation. If we do these two well, transcending location and transportation, it enables the third one, which I think is by far the most important one, is transcending changes in ownership. When something is made at a factory and then handed to a shipping company, then handed to some other company, it is going to be touched by 5 or 6, if not more, different companies and parties. And being able to transcend all of that and be uniquely track it, what we call end-to-end visibility, is what's going to enable orchestration.
Just to build on that, part of transcending ownership isn't just on the way to a place, but if a med tech company wants to watch their device gets to the hospital, and the hospital wants to watch it get there, but then you were talking about counting how many are in the closet afterwards, those are two totally separate pieces of information, but we can get the same benefit from the same sensor.
Correct. So in the med tech example, they enable that at their warehouse when they start shipping it to a hospital. And now you as the supplier know that I am sending X amount of things to this particular hospital, and they're going to reach there by so-and-so time, which is important because this is patient care. The hospital knows that I am receiving this many of this particular product, and I'm going to have it by tomorrow morning. And when it gets there, we now have a positive proof that it has actually been delivered, because we know that. Then when they move them into their lab or the department, wherever it is that it's going, it becomes an inventory management issue. And you go, I now have received 10 of these things, and I need 10 of them. When you use it, we know when it's used. So now we can tell you, 8 of them got used today, so why don't you ship 8 more? It connects the entire loop, and you're not using multiple systems to do it. You're not sitting there changing sensors or doing any of those. It's all being enabled by a single mechanism, which is Chorus, and that's what we call orchestration.
Is your sense that 2/3 of what has to be tracked in the world is healthcare? Is it 10%? How much of it is like fish and hamburgers? How much of it is healthcare?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of impact, things like healthcare and food are high impact because it's like directly affecting people. Things like automotive or construction, it's affecting people from a productivity standpoint and from not wasting money standpoint. I think if we can enable at least 30% of all the things that happen in healthcare, maybe 50% of everything that happens in food, and 25% of what happens in all other, I think we can have a pretty dramatic impact on every one of those industries.
When you started, it made sense that some of the earliest stuff that you were tracking was things that were very expensive and that were very sensitive. Actually, COVID vaccines were some of the earliest things that you were tracking. But as you've broadened out, you've come to realize that almost everything is worth tracking. Food might not be obvious to the listeners here about why tracking a box of something that's going to a quick service restaurant even matters. Does it?
It does. I was under the wrong impression, and the example that I always used to think about is, it might not be worth tracking or enabling a box that is carrying lettuce, because we might not be able to justify the cost of it. And a partner of ours opened my eyes to this thing, that what is the number one thing that particular restaurant is thinking about every single day? Am I providing the customer with what that customer has come into the restaurant for? And if they came in and they wanted a hamburger and you did not have lettuce, you can't make a hamburger. So the lettuce is as important as the bun and as the meat and all the other condiments that go with it. So it is incredibly important to make sure that you have lettuce. And it's the same thing in automotive. If you don't have a bolt, you're not going to be able to complete finishing the car.
It's just one bolt.
But the car is not ready. So that's where I think the realization happened, or the learning happened for us is, okay, high value things make sense, but it's really everything that you have to get to, and which is what drove a lot of our product strategy around it.
Maybe funny story of working with customers.
One that comes to my mind is a particular client of ours. It was taking them 28 days to get something from point A to point B. And I always joke that I won't tell you the names, the origin and the destination, but you can walk faster than 28 days to get it from point A to point B. And it could be like, how is this possible? How is this even possible? First thing, they couldn't measure it. Second thing, once we measured it, it was 28 days. So we start looking at it, and they start enabling it with quotas. The carrier that was taking these things picked it up from their location, and about 2 blocks away, the trailer sat there for 2 weeks and never moved.
Regularly.
Yeah. So you could walk out of your warehouse and see the trailer over there, and it's still sitting there 2 weeks later, and it hasn't moved. So then the fundamental question is, why is it sitting there? Nobody knew the answer. People just assume that once it left, it's moving. It's not. So is it going bad? When once they fixed it, sure, the 28 days got reduced to less than 7 days. Now just think about how much money you save. So we hear stories like this pretty much on a daily basis.
Imagine it's 5 or 10 years from now, and Chorus has been wildly successful. What's different about the world? I'd love to hear from each of you an example or best case scenario of how much better the world's working in some really concrete way.
One thing when the pandemic started, one of the things we always talked about when everyone was struggling to find ventilators, we talked about what if there was actually already a Chorus sensor on every ventilator? So this whole question of where are they being used? You probably remember in the news over the months, people would find them in warehouses or in hospital basements. We could have just told you, this is where all the ventilators are in this country. This is where they are in the world. And that whole problem would have just gone away. And I think in general, a lot of these supply shocks and these things where people are hoarding, it's because there's no sense of where these goods are.
Reducing or eliminating, hopefully, wastage. I mean, $35 billion is worth of pharmaceuticals expire every single day. I mean, that's stuff that a patient can benefit from. A billion people go hungry, and we're throwing away 40+% of the food that we do. If we can reduce that in a meaningful fashion, or hopefully eliminate it, then our resources can be utilized far more efficiently, and people can benefit from that. I think it will fundamentally change how we behave and how we interact with just physical assets and things that we use on a daily basis.
Well, Stephen and Suresh, I love the idea that you guys are out in the world and indexing the physical world at the rate you are. It's really pretty phenomenal to watch Chorus scaling up, and I can't wait to see what you guys do next. It's inherent in the process of taking moonshots. Most of them don't work out. But that makes it all the more exciting to hear from groups like Chronicle and Chorus and their moonshots, having run the gauntlet, all the pressure testing, getting to the other side, and now already having sizable impact on these huge issues, these huge problems in our lives. Both of them are demonstrating that if you bring visibility to something that was previously unseen in an area that really matters to humanity, we probably have just scratched the surface of what you can do with that new information. I'm really looking forward to where both of the groups go from here. Next time on the Moonshot Podcast, what if we could see the detailed wiring of a brain and use that to peek into the future of artificial intelligence and diagnose and support people with mental illnesses?
Your human brain only takes up as much energy as a flashlight.
Mental health has never really had very good ways of measuring it. And that's just a completely unacceptable state of affairs.
This is the Moonshot Podcast, a peak action production for X, the Moonshot Factory, with me, Astro Teller. You can find more episodes wherever you get your podcasts and on our YouTube channel. If you want to take your own moonshots, we've developed a masterclass certificate course. Check it out in the show notes below. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe. It helps other people find out about this series.